class, the theme for the class would be From One Man Comes a Nation. I'm not an expert. I'm not all-knowing, so if you have any comments about the class or what I'm talking about, just feel free to ask me or actually step in. But this morning I'm going to talk about Abraham, and I think I'm teaching the next 3 classes on Abraham. So what I'd like to start is with Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 27. And so that begins with the Tower of Babel. What's kind of unique is that the genealogies in the scripture shows a transitional leap from the primeval period to the time of the patriarchs. And saying this is whereby God begins his redemptive process. So what's neat about this is that if you go back to the time of Noah, so by the time Abraham comes up, so we're talking 10 generations later. And so then in chapter 11, it goes with the Tower of Babel. So it's 5 generations after the Tower of Babel where Abraham comes up. And so it's during this time, and some of the research that I've done, what was unique about this period was that in the period of Noah, it's pretty obvious that the lifespan totally changed. And some of the research that I did, they talked about the potential, the idea that which was, to me, seems kind of obvious, that the environment and the atmosphere in which Noah existed during the time of Noah was much, much different than it was during the time of Abraham, where the lifespan greatly decreased. And so in Noah's time, for example, the lifespan, about 900 years. Noah lived 950 years. Abraham lived 175 years. So I'm going to kind of point some of those things out. And then also, what's also unique about Abraham is the fact that he had a lot of faith. Now, his abundance of faith came after he was called, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But one of the things I found interesting was that when I first read about Abraham being called, I was inaccurate or incorrect in what I was thinking until I did a little more research. And so we'll go into that as well. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. All right, so in Genesis 11, beginning with that, just the chapter tells us that Shem's descending genealogy, we already kind of talked about that as far as the 10 generations later. But what I also found interesting was that Abraham was the third and the youngest son of Terah. Now, in verse 26 of Genesis 11, it says, "Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran." So it's, in the Middle East, in these areas and regions, the oldest is always named first. But that's not the case here. Abraham was the youngest, and so I did a little bit of research, and I really couldn't find anything that said that Abraham was definitely the youngest, but it gave a bunch of different examples. And so because of that, this is interesting because he's listed before his 2 older brothers as the sons of Terah, but this is likely because of the heir or the position that Abraham was to hold as the father of all nations. So the Abraham family, the clan of Terah, they resided in the Chaldea. Now, if you look up on the map there, Chaldea, it's modern-day Iraq. So I don't know if that's Mesopotamia and everything. And what's unique is that if you look at those 2 rivers, the Euphrates on the left and Tigris, those are still very, very significant today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that too, because when he was called, he goes from Ur of the Chaldees, and he goes all the way up into Turkey. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that route and his travel. But during that time of Abraham, it was one of the Chaldees' oldest cities, if not the most ancient. And it was 6 miles from the Euphrates River and nearly 125 miles from the Persian Gulf. So the Persian Gulf is down there, right there in the corner. So another map will show a little bit better. But in that area, so just to give you a little idea, so there's a guy named Wilfred Thesiger who kind of mapped out the Middle East, and he also talks about the Marsh Arabs. The Marsh Arabs are in the southern part, past where the Ur of the Chaldees is. But in that whole area, there are known as pagans. And so they have a unique history as far as the pagan history, and they worship the sun god. So when they travel up to Haran, they also worship the sun god as well. And so we'll kind of get into that as well, because from the reading and the research that I've done, Abraham was called twice. But then, well, when you first read about him in the Old Testament, his father takes him up. At least that's what it seems. But then when you read, when you look at other scriptures, it tells you that he was called twice. So looking at verse 31 in Genesis of chapter 11, it says, and Terah took his son Abraham, excuse me, that's one thing I want to point out. I keep saying Abraham, it's a habit. I was talking to my wife about this. So he was called Abram at this point in time. So I'm going to call him Abraham, not on purpose, but if I do, just understand that we'll talk about that when he gets to that point where his name is called Abraham, but his name is Abram. So, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with him from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So going back to Abram's age, right? So Abram's going to be called in the next chapter 12. He's 75 years old, or 75 years old. And if you minus 205 minus 75 is 130 years old. So that means that Abram was born 130 when Terah was 130. Now, if my math, if you find them inaccurate, you just let me know. So that is some of the evidence that they use to confirm or to validate that Abraham was not born first, but he's named first because of the promise and of his position for God and God's calling. So it says here that Terah took his son, and of course his grandson Lot, and so this here says that he left. Right, so he took his family and they went to Haran. Now, I was wondering about that because where does it say that he was called, that Abraham was called? And so in doing some research, if we go to Acts chapter 7, verse 2, is everybody following me so far? Am I making sense? Okay. All right. That's one. All right. Oh yeah, I do have it listed. Okay. So in Stephen's address, it gives he talks about the call of Abraham. So then the high priest said, I'm going to read from chapter 7, and I'm going to go into it from first verse and the second verse. Then the high priest said, are these things so? And he said, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, get out of your country, from your relatives, and come to the land that I will show you. Then he came out of the land of the land of the Chaldeans, and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. So that tells me that he was definitely called. Okay, so, and again, referencing back to Genesis, where it says, Genesis 11, chapter 31, Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, so that the Bible tells us what happened. Sometimes it doesn't give us all the details, right? So it just tells you, matter of fact, that this person did that, or this is what happened. But in reading sometimes further, we know that he was definitely called. So what I was taught as a child, and what versus what I read, because I was reading through this, and I was like, well, I just know that he was called twice, but I didn't know, based on the initial reading, that was the case. So he was definitely called. And again, the key here is Abraham's faith. Okay, so There's a lot of things here. So the next question that I had was, you know, Joshua chapter 24, verses 2, and then 14 through 15 tells us that we talk about the whole pagan worship thing, right? So it says here that Terah served other gods, and it was out of the city of Ur that Abraham was called. So reading Joshua chapter 24, verses 2, it says, "And Joshua said to all the people, Thus says the Lord, God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in the old times, and they served other gods." And then 14 and 15. Verse 14 to 15. "Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which our fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So there you have it. So again, why was Abraham picked? You know, he was a pagan just like everybody else, but there's something obviously special about him that God chose to pick him. And then the other question I had is, why did they stop in Haran? So if Abraham was called to go from Ur of the Chaldees, and he went to Haran, why they stop in Haran, or excuse me, Turkey? All right, so they're going all the way up north. They stop in Turkey, and then, but it's kind of interesting. So if they're supposed to go to the land of Canaan originally, one of the thing is that actually the closest route would be to go west, but that's not the way that people travel back then, and that's not the way that people travel now. So in Iraq, out west, the Marines that served out there and the Army folks that served out there in the MD West area, that area is just terrible. Now, again, the environment we see there today is a lot different than, let's say, 60, 70 years ago. Wilfred Thesiger, who mapped out the Middle East, talked about all of the life of the different animals. So a lot of animals that you see in Africa, they actually existed in the Middle East all over the place. So they had different types of, they had lions, they had all kinds of venison-type animals that they hunted, and the wildlife was pretty abundant. It was only after the discovery of oil that things drastically changed, and areas became hunted, and deserts became true deserts, where not much life ever existed. But even back then, though, you're talking about an area, when you travel, having a full stomach full of meat was something very, very special. And it's times, and during those times, that people actually talked about them. They would reminisce, remember when. Water was still difficult. And so even the animals that lived in those areas, and the Bedouins that traveled all throughout that area, they would travel and they would move based on different seasons and whatnot. But certain areas would be dried out. And in certain areas, during certain times of the year, the seasons, they'd have water, and there were watering holes and spots. And in fact, a lot of the people that would fight in these areas, they were even considered zealots and vigorous and almost crazy. And so there's a lot of fighting that was constantly. Tribes in different Bedouin areas, when they would gather and set up in groups, they would raid each other. In between growing and moving their animals and stuff like that. So it was a very difficult area, and wasn't a safe area. The less difficult, but still a little difficult and dangerous route, was to go to the fall of the river. And historically, that's an area where people would congregate, and they would set up their villages or whatever, because they're easy places to get water, places to feed the animals, and of course that's where a lot of the vegetation is, and it's all lush in that area. When I was in Mosul, the Euphrates, the place is completely built up there. Of course, Nineveh's up there as well, but that's up north. But that river is still a huge center of what I call cities and built up areas and whatnot. And a lot of people live in those areas. Okay, now back to Genesis 12. Or Genesis, I'm going to start with Genesis 12, chapter 12, verses 1. So that indicates that after Terah died at 205, God separated Abraham from his, one of the things I wrote here is from his idolatrous family. So it was evident that they still were pagans. But he left his descendants, so he was at that point in time going to move down or make a travel down into the land of Canaan. So the second call from God consisted of a fourfold command and a fourfold promise. And so that is what we read here in chapter 12, verse 1 of Genesis. So what we have here is what it says is, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the fourfold command is, one, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. So that goes into those commands in those areas and the promises that God makes. In Hebrews, again, this is by faith. Now, the thing is before I was going to mention Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, but it talks about Abraham's faith. But I'm kind of skipping ahead here. But I'm going to talk about how difficult it must have been. But think about it. So let's say you live in an area that you're really wealthy, and it's kind of easy today, so it's not really fair to use today's time because we live, we pretty much can go anywhere. And if you have an education and you have the type of background and the experience, you pretty much can go anywhere in this country and work. But it hasn't always been the case for places like in the Middle East. In a lot of those areas, I call it a caste system. So if you've ever been to India or Pakistan or any of those areas, and even in the Middle East, so if you want to read an interesting book, the Arab Sands and the Marsh Arabs are pretty interesting because for generations and generations, those people that we don't ever talk about, they don't even exist anymore. When they started making hard lines and dividing countries and saying, this country is Iran, this country is Iraq, this country is Saudi Arabia, this country is Kuwait. They've always been known to be those areas, but Bedouins have not. They've been known to move from one country to the next based on areas, based on vegetation, based on whatever they need. And so that was the tradition in that area. And there's a lot of people who would talk, even back then, about their lineage all the way back to Abraham, and for the most part Ishmael, and the relationship. But they would trace their family lineage all the way back to Abraham, and they could talk about it. I've been to the Middle East several times as a Army dude, and the first time I went was in the 90s, and it was my first experience talking to, I was in Kuwait, and I also talked to Saudis, and I talked to Egyptians, and I fought side by side with these people. And the thing that I found very interesting is when we're sitting in these big patrol bases, how they would talk about their religion, but they would also talk about their family background. And they knew more about their family, going all the way back to, as far as you can imagine. And it seemed a totally different world. It was, for me anyway. But, I can't remember that far back with my own family, and my own family history has been broken up quite a bit. So but I was amazed at how well these people could just recall stories of going generations and generations back, and it was pretty amazing. But anyway, the point is that as successful as Abraham and his family were, for them to just pick up and go and leave Ur of the Chaldees, and then especially when they went up to Haran and they made a life there, and then they moved again to an unknown country, to an unknown place of unknown experiences and danger potentially. It had to be by a great amount of faith for them to do that, to uproot the whole family and just move and leave. And so, and that's another thing that we're going to talk about at some point is, the fear that Abraham had at certain points, even though he had a lot of faith. Anyway, so going back to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. Well, I'm just going to read it. Sorry. So by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. And then verse 9, it says, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. So the nation of Israel was not going to be formed simply by gathering a group of people, but it came through Abraham's calling, through the calling of a single man. And so this is kind of unique. How am I on time, sweetheart? Okay. So anyway, so there's a lot of in the New Testament. One of the things that and again I was trying to put all this together, and I was wondering because what's that show we watch? The Chosen, right? So we watch The Chosen and everything else. So there's points when if those of you who've watched The Chosen, you see the Pharisees and the Sadducees all talking about how can Jesus meet with all these Gentiles, and how can he hang out with these sinners and all this other stuff. And so this right here tells me that the greatness of God and the promise that he gave to Abraham, he meant not just the Jews, right, because they were people, the Hebrews, but it was meant for all of us. And so that's more powerful. Of course, if you read about in Exodus when the Israelites left from Egypt, when they were escaping through away from Pharaoh, I mean, they had a mixed multitude that went with them and actually followed them and worshiped like them. They also caused a lot of problems, but that's another event. Mm-hmm. Right, right, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, right, 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 right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. It's compete. Yep. Roger that. Roger that. Yeah. Roger that. It was a foreign land, foreign people, foreign environment for him. And Jay, like you said, it's approximately 400 miles, or excuse me, 500 miles from where he was up in Haran, and it's another 400 miles going back southwest down into Canaan. Um, and so, but yeah, good points, excellent points. Um, so, Genesis chapter 12, um, we already covered that, 1 and 3. And so, when I researched the land of Canaan, um, it's the land of Canaan is inhabited by the descendants, the Noah's descendants, right? Or actually his grandson, excuse me. So you have, let's see, you have Canaan, the Hittites, the Jebusites, Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, all the groupings of people that caused him a lot of problems. Abraham, that caused Abraham a lot of problems, and the Jewish, the Hebrews and the Jewish people in the future a lot of problems. But when I researched the land of Canaan, I learned that it was also known for, during that time of Abraham, it was known for the Bronze Age, and it was made up of many different individual cities. But it was a perfect environment for farming, for growing, and they grew all kinds of stuff. So they grew grains, they grew grapes, figs, legumes, olives, garlic, onions, leeks, cucumbers, and lots of other crops. What's that? Oh. So, so I will continue next week. I'm really surprised that I didn't get to the other map. But next week, we'll talk a lot more about Abraham, and then we'll talk about Sarah. And then the first trial that he had that distracted him from his mission and his goal, and him going to Egypt and everything else. But I'll hit that next week. I hope this was good. I hope it's helpful, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.